And then to start, to start taking on something like this, so enormously expensive, tinkering is one of the few industries that actually is creating jobs in a very negative way, when we have the more pressing problem of still being in economic crisis, is insane. But the fiscal problems are relatively small, I think, compared to what it's going to do to healthcare. And we just heard about how difficult it is already for doctors. The IBD did a poll. They found that 45% of doctors would consider retiring if this bill passes. So we're talking about bringing 25 or 30 million more people into the insurance system, people who don't use a lot of healthcare now. We're going to have much more demand for healthcare and many fewer doctors to provide it. That will inevitably lead to shortages, to waiting lines, and to rationing of care. And this bill actually contemplates and puts in place a system for rationing care. It's called Comparative Effectiveness Research. The first funding for this was sneaked through in the stimulus bill earlier this year that nobody really knew about. And they are going to set up a council that is going to do research, that is going to decide what treatments should be available for what conditions. They're going to have access to all of our medical records in a national database. And they will make treatment recommendations to doctors that doctors will be under enormous pressure to follow. If they don't follow them, they could be at risk for litigation. If they don't follow them, they could face penalties. We are going to have a system in which centralized control decides who gets what care and when, as the only way to deal with the shortages that the bill itself will create. Whatever you think about the healthcare system we have now, and obviously it's not perfect, there are a lot of positive reforms you could have, I think the approach we need to take is the approach of doing no harm, the Hippocratic Oath, and this bill does enormous harm. And I mention the Hippocratic Oath also because the mentality of comparative effectiveness research throws it out the window, self-consciously throws it out the window. Ezekiel Emanuel, Rahm Emanuel's brother, is one of the president's high-level healthcare advisors. And for the past 20 years, he's been writing papers in the field of so-called medical ethics, which is an amazing name for a field that seems anything but. And he's been writing about when we should deny people care that they need to stay alive, to save the resources of society at large. Now that, to me, is contrary to everything that we believe in the American system that's based on the individual. The idea that you should be denied care that you want and need and can pay for because society decides that those resources would be better spent elsewhere. But that is the ideology that's behind this bill. That is why they don't mind all the shortages that will be created, because they think they have a system to manage them. And they fundamentally believe, and Tom Daschle writes this throughout his book, one of the key influences on President Obama on this issue, that, we have lots of unnecessary health care. That the problem is that people are getting all these procedures that they don't need. They want to make procedures unavailable to a lot of people who are getting them right now. That is one of the key motivators in this bill. So we get politicians and bureaucrats getting between patients and doctors in every version of this legislation. We have enormous costs that we can't afford. We have the abrogation of real medical ethics to replace it with this sort of societal standard of how resources ought to be allocated. There is nothing good about this legislation. In fact, the only way that it really reduces the uninsured, by far the lion's share of the reduction of the uninsured in this legislation, comes from a Medicaid expansion. The House bill would add 18 million people to the state Medicaid rolls. Now, that will obliterate most states budgetarily. They will not be able to afford that. It will also put nearly 1 in every 4 Americans on welfare. I mean, the Medicaid eligibility criteria will be such that about 25% of Americans will qualify for Medicaid, for a means-tested welfare program. I would submit that if we want to expand Medicaid, we should have an honest national debate about expanding a huge welfare program, not hide it with 2,000 some other pages of stuff that doesn't have a lot to do with increasing the number of people who are insured, but does have a lot to do with increasing the power of Washington politicians and bureaucrats, increasing our taxes, all kinds of other complexity. I'll give you an example of something that was in this bill that has nothing to do with health care that your own congressman put in. Chris Van Hollen put in a title related to the biofuels tax credit in the health care bill. people found it, it ended up being scaled back in a certain way, but it was in there when they passed it. Now, Nick thinks that I went through the whole bill and know everything that's in it. I'll admit, I don't know everything that's in it. It's almost impossible, even if you've read sections of this, to understand what they mean. It was over 2,000 pages. The last 42 pages were released the day of the vote. This thing is so unbelievably complex. If we want to have real reform, first of all, the process has to be completely different from what we've had. Patients need to have a real seat at the table. This should not be negotiated with special interest deals between the AMA and the AARP and the pharmaceutical manufacturers, the hospitals, and the White House. Scrap that whole process, have the public meaningfully engaged, genuinely engaged. We have a right to know what's in these bills. We have a right to have input in these bills. They should scrap this whole thing, start over with a clean piece of paper. That's the step number one, with all of us in the room, with a seat at the table. Step number two, do not try to change the whole world and redesign the whole system with a grand design. The lesson of the 20th century should have been that central economic planning is a disaster. It fails everywhere it's been tried. But we still have this conceit that these planners are just smarter than the previous generation, more clever. They think they all got it wrong, but we'll get it right. Forget about that. Let's have a series of 15 or 20-page bills that everyone can understand that each take on one aspect of the problem. First, tax reform, so that when you buy health insurance, you have the same tax benefit as when your employer does. Simple. You could write that in a couple of pages. That would solve the whole problem that we heard about in terms of the distortion with the third-party payment problem. Simple. Medical liability reform. There are a number of different ways to do it. You can set up caps. You can set up an independent review. There are a number of ways to do it. Let's have a real debate about that. Get that done in a 20-page bill. Interstate competition. Some states only have 2 or 3 plans in the whole state, 2 or 3 providers, I should say. There's some states that already have the kinds of regulations contemplated by this bill, where they pretty much ran everyone except Blue Cross out of the state. You should be able to buy health insurance from anywhere you want, anywhere in the country. If the disclosures are clear, that should be up to you. It's not one size fits all. Your state insurance regulators, your state legislators shouldn't decide what you're forced to buy. That's simple. You could do that in a short piece of legislation. So I think that we really need to make our voices heard, that this whole approach has been a disaster. We do not want a Washington takeover of our health care, which is what all of these bills amount to. We want to start over, do this the sensible way, one piece at a time. And again, please remember that homework assignment. We can win this, perhaps as soon as this week. All we need to do is keep Olympia Snow on board and pick up one Democrat. If we pick up one Democrat and keep Olympia Snow on board, this whole thing's over this week when they have that first vote, that cloture on the motion to proceed. So if you know anyone in one of those target states, please ask them to call. We need to get every push that we can behind this. If we lose, we'll keep fighting. But if we win, this is over. So we've got a chance here. Thank you very much.